Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to Enterprise Biometrics in the Era of the Data Breach, the culmination of Enterprise Biometrics Month at FindBiometrics. My name is Peter Counter, and I'm the managing editor of FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World, the internet's leading resources for biometrics and mobile ID news, interviews, events coverage, and thought leadership. Before we get started, some quick notes. Today's presentation will run 45 minutes to an hour, and we will be answering audience questions at the end of the panel segment. But since there are hundreds scheduled to attend this webinar, I encourage you to send your questions during the presentation by typing them into your GoToControl panel as the questions come to you. Sending your questions early allows our team to aggregate and organize them, allowing us to address as many of your questions as possible. This webinar presentation is made possible by our Enterprise Biometrics Month sponsors, IDEMIA and BioConnect. Now, since we have a diverse audience from all over the security industry today, I want to start with a bit of background on the topic we'll be discussing. We live in the era of the data breach. Over the past few years, we've seen the biggest leaks of sensitive consumer data in all history. From Yahoo, which had 3 billion users affected over 2 breaches in 2014 and 2016, to Uber, which affected 57 million drivers and riders on their platform, to the social media site TimeHop, which affected 21 million users. Now, these breaches were preventable. Each was caused by compromised credentials. Essentially, cookies were exploited and passwords were cracked, stolen, or left out in the open on GitHub, and that's all it took. Like leaving the key to your front door under your welcome mat, it's sort of like that, only worse, because a password is information, and as we all know, information wants to be free. So we all know there's a password problem because we feel it every day. But in the era of the data breach, there is a lot more at stake. This isn't just embarrassing emails or precious family photos. This is the personally identifiable information of millions and millions of people, names, phone numbers, in some cases, social security numbers, and more. For the businesses concerned, there's also the issue of trust and money. Not only are the companies I mentioned implicated in class action lawsuits, in some cases multi-million-dollar lawsuits, but their reputation has been damaged, and that's bad. In a Vanson-Bourne survey of 10,500 consumers from around the world, 66% of respondents indicated that they are unlikely to do business with a company that suffered a data breach involving the compromise of PII. And 67% of those surveyed between 18 and 24 would pursue legal action in the wake of a data breach. And the really important part here is that, according to the survey, they aren't blaming the hackers. They're blaming the companies that failed to protect their data. Now, on a final note, before I go to the next slide, some of you may be wondering why I didn't include the Equifax breach, which affected 143 million users. And that's because in that specific case, the culprit wasn't a compromised credential. It was a web app vulnerability that hadn't been patched. But that's part of a larger conversation that we're having, which is it's time to take enterprise security and identity seriously. And how do we do that? Well, you probably guessed, we'll be talking about biometrics today. And according to recent reports from Javelin and Spiceworks, businesses from around the world are finally moving into the post-password paradigm. Last year, Spiceworks polled 492 IT professionals. 62% said their organizations use biometric authentication. 24% said that they were planning to implement it by 2020. Javelin's report, the State of Strong Authentication 2019, which was sponsored by the FIDO Alliance, says the number of organizations using multi-factor authentication that includes public key cryptography has tripled since 2017 when it comes to consumer authentication, and it's increased 50% within the enterprise. So that's all very encouraging. Biometrics, for those who need a quick review, are the measurements of your unique physical traits, fingerprints, irises, facial features, behavioral patterns, even your heart rate. that essentially allows us to assert our biological identity as a credential in the physical and logical access scenarios. They replace passwords, providing stronger security balanced with the seamless convenience. Today's conversation is about how biometrics are rising to today's modern security challenges in the workplace, addressing the data breach problem and others. It's a continuation of an industry discussion initiated 2 weeks ago in Las Vegas at ISC West, the biggest converged security conference in the Americas. To start things off, it's my pleasure to welcome ISC organizer Will Weis, Group Vice President of the Security Industry Portfolio for Reed Exhibitions. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate being on the webinar.
Absolutely. So Will's going to start off by telling us a little bit about ISC West.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So yeah, like you said, it feels like it was just a couple days ago, but it was 2 weeks ago in Las Vegas, ISC West. It was a terrific event, and FindBiometrics team did fantastic coverage. I know I gained a lot of insights just from reading all the articles once I got back from the event, but it was one of the biggest ISC West events ever, over 30,000 attendees. The show floor was bigger than ever with 300,000 square feet of expo space, almost 1,000 companies. We had really strong keynotes, one by the DHS Science and Technology Tech Director, and also San Francisco 49ers from Levi Stadium. And by the way, biometrics was brought up in both of those keynotes, which I think is very telling. A few years ago, you might not have seen that, but on the main stage keynote format, it was a conversation point both by the presenters, but also in the Q&A. Overall, ISC, in our partnership with the Security Industry Association, who's our premier sponsor, together we've been celebrating 50 years now in the industry for in security and public safety, and had a great event there in Las Vegas. Starting to get our post-show attendee survey back, which is always interesting for feedback on the industry and the audience profile. And one of the early data points I was looking at this week, I think is very telling about the strong direction of biometrics being very seriously implemented and in project phase now, is almost 60% of our end user attendees reported that they have active biometrics projects. So I think that's pretty exciting for the industry and from the commercial perspective, but most importantly to make sure we have safer systems, better authentication, and just way more accuracy with our security. The educational programs at the event were a big hit. A few of the top attended sessions, actually the biometrics sessions about how biometrics enabling convergence of physical and info security was one of our top attended sessions, which was exciting to see. And other relevant sessions for our topic today, including like interoperability as relates to access control and smart buildings, the whole element of fusion centers and security operations. That really is about how more and more companies are trying to integrate or have collaboration between cyber and IT teams and the physical security people. Also perimeter security, obviously a big topic in terms of protecting critical infrastructure. I'm certainly seeing biometrics becoming a conversation point there all the time. And then lastly, one of the strongest sessions was on the overall smart cities, smart buildings, and converged security. So a lot of things that are very relevant, and some of the highlights from the event. Just a quick take here on what's next for the ISC security events portfolio. Our flagship event is ISC West that we just had in Las Vegas, but we have a very strong series of conferences throughout the year. Next up is our big Mexico City event that's called Expo Seguridad. That's in early May. And then we go to Sao Paulo in third week of June, ISC Brazil, which is a very strong event. Obviously, Mexico and Brazil, both huge security and safety issues and needs. And then we're doing a targeted summit-based event in Dallas called Cyber Secured Forum. That's really a drill down VIP level summit on cyber and physical security integration. And then we wrap up the year at ISC East in November in New York City. That event's been growing like gangbusters. And then just a quick reminder, next year ISC West is a little bit earlier. It's actually March 17th through 20th next year. So I just appreciate the support and really a lot of fantastic conversations that came out of the event 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that overview, Will. And we obviously, we've been saying it for years. We've been covering ISC West for a very, very long time. And, it's always interesting to see how the role that ISC West plays in terms of the year-long conversation and how we get to kind of check back in at these different ISC events as it develops. It's really fascinating. Now, before we get into the full panel, I just want to touch on a few biometrics trends at ISC West. While I have you here, in your ISC West interview with FindBiometrics' Director of Digital Content, Susan Stover, you mentioned a few years ago CISOs seem to be in denial about data security and privacy concerns. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how have attitudes changed recently, and what are integrators looking for?
Yeah, I do think it's a truth that if you look back 4 or 5 years ago, when you had CISOs and people that were in charge of, say, a lot of the physical security assets at enterprise and government locations, be it their cameras, access control systems, alarms, other devices related to that, is I really think a few years ago was more of the fact that cybersecurity and IT security was seen as handled by somebody else. Maybe, you know, the folks running the enterprise network, or who's in charge of cell phone deployments and computer systems. But with some pretty storied hacks that have occurred the last 2 years in the industry, where cameras have been hacked, or even a thermometer in a casino lobby, in a big fish tank, all kinds of devices that are now connected, of course, to the internet, the IoT factor. I think there's a much stronger awareness that everybody has to be involved in the cyber and data breach, you know, part of things. So awareness has definitely become a front burner from our perspective. That's been telling in the huge rise of educational program demand at our events for cybersecurity and data security, and relates to physical security. So I think it's changed a lot. It's forcing the conversation and forcing silos to get broken down relative to how this is handled. And then the big part of this is the manufacturing side. So the great product manufacturers having to really start building in security from their R&D process. And I think there's some really healthy conversations about that being a priority.
That's really interesting. I know you and I were speaking before this call about how the global nature of the industry, and with the rise of IoT, there's actually a lot of interesting international component partnerships, component manufacturing partnerships that are sort of becoming a part of the security conversation too.
Definitely. I think more than ever, I think traditionally when it comes to enterprise computer systems, security products, sometimes, you know, what is inside the system, the components and parts, traditionally has not been as important. But I think these days, with national security concerns, who's actually making the semiconductors and the chips, and, you know, what are the partnerships? You know, it is a global economy. I think those, you know, the questions are definitely being asked, whether it's government or enterprises, about, okay, wanting to understand from the R&D process and how your products are being designed, what are those partnerships and what are those elements, it is something everybody's got to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Now, your presentation, you mentioned that the biometrics presence at ISC West is growing. You know, biometrics was mentioned in the keynotes, like you said, which is a huge thing, especially given the larger idea of what those keynotes were about, DHS and, you know, and national sports franchise. But what is it about biometric technology that makes it so appealing as a security solution in today's enterprise landscape, from like a large industry view?
I would say that obviously with a majority of modern cell phones incorporating it now, it's becoming something that is expected. It also, I think, does reflect on innovation and have just confidence and trust. So you brought it up at the beginning, you know, authentication, accuracy of who's actually engaging with our systems, who's getting into buildings, you know, who's allowed for permission for certain rights to certain, you know, devices. I just think it's needed, because we all know passwords are flawed. We all know that in terms of online fraud, for example, it's really easy for people to do account takeovers, to do identity fraud, and we need to authenticate. We need to validate who is actually accessing our systems, buildings, and environments. So this is why I think it's front burner. I do think it's way more accepted now. Heck, I use the Clear system when I go to the airport. You know, I've gone to a couple of stadiums where I've used that. It's I think it's reached a point too where it's accepted, more, by the user, which is important relative to those society questions. So all of that is going in the right direction.
Yeah, and kind of talking about this this forward momentum and everything, biometrics, security, physical access, identity technologies, they're all evolving at an extremely rapid pace, which is why it's nice to be able to check in throughout the year at various conferences. And you also have a huge educational component to ISC West. Why is it important for the security industry to foster a continuous conversation geared towards the education of end users?
Yeah, what we've seen at ISC is probably 6-7 years ago, you would have said a vast majority of our attendees and that were going to education were integrators and dealers and resellers. Today, it's very balanced. It's quite a nice balance of end users from the top enterprise verticals and then also government. So it's educating the end user about how to innovate, how to adopt emerging technologies is very important. I hear this often relative to, oh, it's hard with innovation and new technologies to get that into a formal procurement process, whereas other products that have been around, for decades, it's just a part of the formal process. So educating on how to literally innovate, but also how to fuse new technology evaluation into a purchase process, we feel is very important. Some of that's technology confidence, but a lot of it is process and people. So that's been a big focus to educate the end user, but then also making sure the integrators are ready to innovate as well and not just do what's easy.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think that's a really perfect note on which to open this conversation up to our other esteemed guests. It is my pleasure to introduce everyone to Gary Jones, Vice President, Global Channel and Marketing for Biometric Access and Time Solutions and Biometric Terminals at IDEMIA, and Rob Douglas, the Chairman and CEO of BioConnect. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Let's continue on the topic of ISC West as a segue. What were the most notable identity and biometrics trends at ISC West from your perspective? And I'd like to start with Gary on this one, please.
Sure, thank you, Peter. So 3 key points stood out for us. First, we're seeing a very high demand for fingerprint-based frictionless biometric access control. As you noted earlier, due to the high visibility of breaches that have occurred, more security operators and officers are conscious of the need to have strong physical security, which means a dramatic change for those who've been holding out for a long time, sticking to traditional systems. So when they're making this jump to biometrics, they want to be sure that it's seamless and that the throughput is very high, especially when they're dealing with lots of employees. And that's where the demand for frictionless biometrics is coming from. The reason for fingerprint-based technology is that there's still a good balance between proximity assurance. People want to be sure that if they're identifying people on the move, that they can only be at arm's length away from the turnstile, the door, or the gate when they're authenticated. We're also seeing the same technology being used more and more at perimeters for vehicle access, because people are wanting to move their biometric security further out, not just at the lobby or internal doors. And that's definitely been a strong trend. One final very interesting point to see it materialize now with the advancements in AI and also with the advancements in the IP camera industry is that for the first time, it's really becoming possible and more prevalent to see large enterprises layer biometrics. What I mean by that is the use of existing surveillance infrastructure, putting a biometric layer, facial recognition and analytics on top of that, so that you can have much earlier threat detection and move your monitoring beyond fixed doors or fixed points, so that you can have a much greater reach into open spaces within the building, outside into the actual campuses, and even sometimes into the street, depending on where the customer is based. So these are really good trends, which I think from a biometric perspective, we've all seen them coming, but now several things have happened in terms of technology enablement to make them real and start materializing.
Very fascinating. Can I get your opinion on this, Rob?
Yes, you can. Thank you, Peter. We see the same elements that Gary is referring to. My additional comment would be is having attended ISC now for many years, the thing that was most striking to me was the amount of biometric vendors that were at ISC. just the sheer quantity of them was noticeably greater than I've seen in the past. And the second is the attention to cybersecurity, which is part of the purpose of this event. I made a note, and we made a note as a company, of the amount of people who are bringing solutions to market around cyber-related issues.
Great, and sort of moving in that same direction, kind of asking the core question of this webinar, Rob, maybe you can start on this. How can biometrics prevent data breaches like the ones that we've seen in recent years, the ones I've described earlier and others as well?
I'm going to start by just giving a very personal example. You know, we all talk about, you know, cyber attacks and data breaches and how do we plug the holes or reduce the attack vector. Have any of you in this webinar, have you actually had your ID and password stolen? Have you ever experienced that before? Last October, I received an extortion attempt that came into my business, and at the time I was quite taken back by it. And I made contact with our CTO, also a CISO, and said to him, I said, look, here's what I just received, you know, what should I do? And he said, look, Rob, just give me a little bit of time, I'll come back to you. Within 2 hours, he came back and he showed me a database over 1 billion ID and passwords, and he pulled out my ID and password. And he said, Rob, do you realize that this is publicly for sale in the dark world? And it was at that moment that I realized, wow, this is a very significant problem. Here I am in the industry, and my own credentials are now available for sale. And so this idea of using ID and passwords is over. I can say that having now experienced it personally. Anyone who's using an ID and password to authenticate to anything is living in a world of significant risk. It's just a matter of time where a breach will occur. And so this problem has to be solved as the amount of attack operatives out there is only accelerating. And so, you know, biometrics is a way, either as a step up to an existing ID and password or a replacement to a password, a much tighter way to authenticate without fraudsters being able to penetrate.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's really great to sort of bring that into that personal experience, because it isn't a hypothetical thing anymore. I think it's something that people can really understand. Gary, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So I think, first of all, it's important to mention that biometrics is, nothing is ever a silver bullet in security, and that includes biometrics. But biometrics is very key in the overall solution. Other complementary methods, as you mentioned, you know, many of the, or let's say the majority of breaches that have occurred are due to stolen credentials of some sort or another. What's important to add to those credentials, apart from things like static usernames and passwords, which are the vulnerabilities, are rotational elements like rotating pins or one-time pins that can be tied to the transaction. But more importantly, what biometrics brings in terms of value is positive assurance of who the user is that's actually logging in through their biometric, whether it be a face, fingerprint, or iris. But then also biometrics has another important component, which is liveness or spoof detection, to determine whether or not the biometric being presented to the system is a genuine one. Once again, though, I think it's also important to mention in terms of overall engineering, you know, you have to look at things like the potential of man-in-the-middle attacks, make sure that false data cannot be injected between the biometric device and the back-end system. But these are things that are well known and well understood, and we're seeing more and more good applications or deployments of technology to stop these kinds of things from happening.
Absolutely, thanks very much. So I want to move on to the next question. Will, hopefully I can get you to weigh in on this to start off the conversation, because I think it's a big one. You know, most of the high-profile data breaches we've seen are the result of compromised credentials, and I'm wondering, what are the other threats facing the modern enterprise, and how can biometrics address them?
I like what Rob talked about, is that everybody, regardless of the role they play, there is a cause and effect, across the whole ecosystem. So let's say there's a huge industrial facility where it's not consumer facing, so to speak, but there's big building management control systems, in play. That the impact of that environment pretty quickly can lead to a breach into the enterprise network, but can then lead to literally consumer data being exposed on the dark web, and then there you go, then the fraud numbers for online going through the roof, which they are. So it's pretty daunting when you think about the cause and effect from an environment you might not think all of a sudden could impact the wider, just literally consumer and economy. So this is where I think it's going to be challenging, but certainly absolutely needed. If you think about just the millions and millions of video cameras that are in so many locations and alarm systems, is how do we layer in, like you said, a higher degree of authentication, and biometrics certainly should play a role there. It's going to be a process, and I get back to the funding, internal funding and budgets that people have. I think this is, conversations like this, we all need to evangelize that, so there is the right budgets being put in place, because there's just so much legacy equipment out there right now that's very much exposed.
Absolutely. Rob, can I get you to weigh in on this, please?
Oh, I don't know if I actually have an additional comment that I can offer specific to this. I think what Will's described is I line up well to.
Great. And Gary, I know you're coming at this from a specific vantage point, specifically with fingerprint and frictionless physical authentication, as well as time and attendance. What are some emerging enterprise threats beyond the data breach and compromised credentials?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen as a trend on the physical security space is, in the last, let's say, almost 20 years that we've been doing biometrics, and I think most of our counterparts in the industry will agree, you had a few select people in the security organization of any given end user who took it upon themselves to put in higher assurance authentication and implement biometrics for security purposes. And like I said, it was driven by the security departments. Today, what we're seeing is that there's a much higher level of awareness that CEOs are getting fired because of data breaches that occur, and those breaches can occur many times due to physical breaches, not just cyber attacks. So what we found is that a lot of large enterprise clients are actually employing third-party consultants to do physical vulnerability assessments. And these assessments include everything from brute force attacks, literally breaking through certain barriers or doors, to things like pickpocketing, access cards off of employees in a busy elevator or in a crowded space, as another example, or even more subtle methods of gaining access to people's door cards or PIN numbers, etc. But in doing so are exposing the vulnerabilities or loopholes that exist in the physical space, and helping organizations to plug those holes. Because at the end of the day, whether it's a data center or even a corporate office, it's very easy for somebody to get into that space with a hostile, for example, USB thumb drive planted in the back of somebody's workstation and create an attack that way around, or even more simplistically, to walk out with a laptop containing sensitive data where they have it at home and they can spend as many hours as they need to get hold of it. So we're definitely seeing a change in awareness, and that's becoming a much more integral part of corporations' overall security policy. And certainly, for example, in the financial sector would be one of them. We're seeing much more precise auditing measures and standards that are being put in place to actually regularly audit the physical security systems of major enterprises, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and this question sort of brings me to another topic that I think is really good for today, because Rob and Gary, you were both on the FindBiometrics SIA education panel at ISC West about the convergence of these two sort of authentication security paradigms that we're talking about, the information and the physical. And I'm going to throw this to you, Rob, to start off. But what is the main difference between physical access biometrics and logical access biometrics now in the enterprise, and how are these paradigms converging?
So the, historically, these have always been two separate organizations within every enterprise. Physical access is completely separate from digital access or logical access, as you describe it. So historically, these two, not only are the organizations separate, but the people providing technologies to them are also separate. And so now you're in a world where the CISO is becoming responsible for both the unification and the risk assessment of both digital as well as physical. And that's actually bringing together now the opportunity of, well, what technologies should we be using for authentication in both the physical and the logical world? And as somebody who's been a student of the biometric industry now for 15 years, it's just incredibly powerful to see now that it can be done. That you can take biometric authentication tools that are being used in logical access and apply them to doors or apply them to IoT events, and you can now create this unification of a person where the identification and the authentication of the person can be done. So an example is I walk into my office in the morning and I authenticate with my biometrics. And my use case I'm using biometrics on my phone to authenticate to get into my office, and now I'm in my office, I can now detect that in fact I'm in the office, and I can use the same authentication technology to get into my business applications. And that is now can be a unified experience. So as somebody who originally saw, as an industry, we saw this in 2007, to see it here in 2019, we actually now can finally do it, is very powerful. And I think will bring up a new era of biometric technologies to be able to satisfy this unification.
Yeah, and I think, I think powerful is the right word for this, because it's such an elegant solution that seems to, it just unifies these paradigms in such a again, powerful way, in such a simple and elegant way. Will, can I get you to weigh in on this, please?
Yeah, I liked where that comment started with the silos breaking down, because they have to, because it's not so disparate in the past, where the physical and facilities equipment versus the digital and logical. We're seeing in our research within ISC, and we have a pretty nice wide horizontal view of people that we engage with. When it comes to converged security solutions that involve physical security, cybersecurity, and IoT all being integrated, what we're seeing from our audience is that there's equal representation in terms of responsibility and collaboration between the physical security operations and facilities people, along with IT and cyber. So that is, we're seeing that as undeniable, and I think there's a lot of catch up to be done, but going in the right direction.
Absolutely. And Gary, can I get you to weigh in on this, please?
Sure. Just a quick example that we were exposed to through one of our customers. A problem that they had to solve was very simple example of why integration of physical and logical is really crucial. Simple case of a disgruntled employee having an issue with a different employee, made a phone call to this employee during office hours. Fake phone call emphasizing some kind of emergency had taken place at home. That employee left their desk in a hurry, left their Windows machine signed on, and needless to say, it was subsequently compromised by the other employee because it was still logged on, and information was stolen off of that machine. It's a very simple example of how, when you layer biometrics both in the physical and logical world, as soon as that employee had rushed off to treat that emergency phone call, even though it was a fake one, he or she could have been authenticated on the way out the door or even out of his or her office, and immediately the Windows session on the workstation could have been signed off. These things are easy to do, but unfortunately, as Rob and Will stated earlier, they haven't been done much in the real world. But fortunately now there's enough awareness of these types of risks that it's starting to materialize, especially in the big enterprise spaces.
Right, and sort of moving into, we've been focusing a lot on solving the problems of these things, but I think it would be interesting to sort of take a pivot And, a lot of disruptive elements like mobility and the sharing economy have changed the enterprise. And I'm wondering, how has that changed the role of onboarding for businesses? Can I get Gary to start with this, please?
Sure. So mobility definitely has its own challenges when it comes to enrolling and registering new employees, particularly to acquire biometrics, where we've seen good leveraging of national infrastructures. For example, if you look at things like the Aadhaar program in India, where every citizen carries a biometric civil ID card, which has face, fingerprint, and iris, that national ID card can be used to authenticate the user when they enroll into any kind of new system, including an employee database. Obviously, depending on the nature of the work that the person is doing, background checkpoints, whether it's, for example, for teachers or people working in the financial sector, those points at which mandatory background checks need to be run make good opportunities to capture and enroll biometrics for future use once the employee is on.
And Rob, can I get your take on this, please?
Yes. So whether it's mobility or whether it's the sharing economy, during enrollment, you still have to bind the user. So this idea of user binding is still very important, and that doesn't go away. What people commonly think is, well, I've got biometrics that are built into my phone, I'm just going to enroll with those. The problem with that is, well, first off, it's very convenient, so that's a really good thing for the user. But it's not bound to the application, and nor is it bound to the enterprise that's providing the application. And you can't have trust without binding. So, so this is a critical point. And sometimes people sort of lose sight of the importance of binding, because the ultimate objective is to establish trust when you're doing a transaction or an authentication of a transaction. So whether in both scenarios, the binding is still required, just like in the old days when you didn't have mobility, you still had to bind the user to the application, so that doesn't go away. But there are technologies out there and companies out there that provide very good onboarding systems, so that at the moment of enrollment, that I can do background checks, that I can do verifications of driver's licenses or passports or Nexus cards or other physical credentials to verify the person before I let them on board and do the enrollments of biometrics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Will, I know you spoke to this a little bit previously in this conversation, but do you have anything to add about the new role of onboarding?
That was some great comments there. I do think traditionally it's been just too much of a checkbox for especially large organizations, and what access to systems, access to the devices. What I've found here at Reed, and we're a very large company, is around the world, is making sure that the IT professionals are really tied in closely with the management and the business units, and that's been very helpful. But also a very systematic process of not just the initial onboarding, say in the first month, but the ongoing approval of access. Here we have, at least on a monthly basis, kind of reapproving access to systems, devices. So all of that very, very critical. And I think the overall onboarding too, when it comes to data breach and data privacies, is really key. Just having strong training right in that first onboarding process, awareness of phishing, awareness of data breach, not just for, okay, what software and what devices are we going to give you access to, but the fact that everybody's got to play a part.
Absolutely. So we're getting a lot of audience questions in. I just want to, before we pivot into that, I'd like to ask one last question to the panel, and we'll start with you on this, Will. How would you like to see the enterprise biometrics landscape evolve over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think, as was observed, there's a great trend, more of just ISC West being a litmus test for at least one big one for the market. Just the number of companies and solutions that are involved has been impressive to see. I think you're going to see the next 5 years it just being way more pervasive across access control systems and companies of all types, and frankly, video and alarm and devices, that it's just going to be way more pervasive versus specialized. So that planning for that growth, planning for that integration is going to be key. And also relative to just continuing to showcase the projects and success stories, the case studies out there, seeing that definitely coming into play just from some of the meetings I was in and conference programs and meetings with DHS and some of the clients out there at the event, just seeing the discussions of real world implementations, both challenges and next steps. So charting that, I think what you said, we do as an industry and for this sector, need to look at 3 to 5 year planning for it. What does that mean holistically, not just the next 6 months?
Completely. And Rob, can I get your opinion on this, please?
Yes, and I'm going to just make a change in one word, which is it's rather than what I'd like to see, as opposed to more what I forecast is going to happen, which hopefully are one and the same. Is that we see that biometrics in physical access and logical access have really been for the high security type transactions. There's a transformation from high security niche type areas to complete consumption of biometrics across all transactions. So I can imagine a world within 3 to 5 years where biometrics will be part of the mosaic of determining the trust that I have that is likely you when you're completing access to a door or access to a particular application or a particular piece of data. And the other thing I think that we're really going to see, because it's actually now underway, is we're going to see large scale deployments, large ones, 50 million, 100 million, like very large project deployments. We're seeing some examples of that within particular countries around the world. India is the one that sort of really sticks out for me, but the others will happen, and we're going to see larger and larger deployments of biometric sensing as part of determining the authentication of a person.
Great. And Gary, can you please add?
Sure, Peter. Yeah, so 3 quick things. The first is we would hope to see some minimum standards come into play for vulnerability assessments, both in the physical and logical security sides. There are different standards in different vertical industries right now, and we see a lot of confusion in this particular space. And I think that's something that hopefully the industry will evolve to very soon. The other one is, as Rob said, we definitely would like to see biometrics become more of a standard. And in doing so, more customers should look at doing things like duplicate searches, cleaning up their existing employee and contractor databases. We find so many organizations have ghost employees or duplicate employees that they're not even aware of, and those represent significant vulnerabilities, which could be cleaned up very easily with a biometric duplicate search across their whole database. And lastly, something that's very encouraging and particularly was great to see the level of interest both at ISC West and subsequent to that in discussions that we've had with many of our partners, is the movement in PLAI, the Physical Logical Access Interoperability program, which is something that you'll see most of the major biometric vendors and access control vendors have definitely jumped on board. That is a great standard that will help minimize risk, especially in large organizations that have to share credentials amongst multiple sites and multiple legacy systems. So that to me is a great indicator that we can do things better in the future, and the industry is willing to do it already. So definitely I would recommend that everybody look up the PLAI standard because it can impact all organizations moving forward in a positive way.
Great, thank you. That's actually, Gary, a really great way to move into this question period. So just for this, I'm not going to necessarily pitch the questions to specific panelists. If anybody has a specific thought on these, please just jump in. And but the first one that we have here are standards emerging for protection of biometric credentials similar to what exists in the payment card industry?
So if I may, I'll make a quick comment on that one, Peter. We didn't mention GDPR, which I think is probably the biggest evolution in terms of data protection during the last 12 to 18 months. It's had a very big impact in Europe, obviously, and customers or companies that do business in Europe. And that is a great example of a very rigorous standard around how biometric data needs to be handled, how the systems need to be deployed, and what rights you give users in terms of their participation in, especially in the use of biometrics, whether it's for getting access to your computer, your office, or even other membership type based systems.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? No? Okay, so I'll go on to the next one. We're getting a few questions about sort of the move away from passwords. One that's kind of syncs it up. Do you see a move away from passwords towards device-based authentication?
I'll add a comment to that. Is yes is the answer. Not just to device-based authentication. So, but maybe I'll put it in the context how we think about it. Is so the password is part of the authentication. So the idea is like identification. The password is authentication. So what else could we be using? Well, we could build trust around a device. So we can establish trust and say that that device is trustworthy. So we'll use that as a replacement or an augmentation to a password. Or we can build trust around a user. And so that's where biometrics come in. So biometrics are your vehicle. It's the last inch between technology and the human, where we're using the information that's unique about me as a human to be able to build trust about the user. So there's a world of building trust around devices, and there's a world about building trust around people.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on that? Okay, I'm getting a few questions here about sort of the direction of adoption, and just to sort of summarize these questions, is our specific biometric modalities and solutions sort of starting in the enterprise internally and then moving towards a sort of B2C area, or is it the other way around?
Peter, I'll add a comment to that. I think it's a mix. You see, obviously, corporate enterprises have a very obvious need to deploy biometrics, and they can do it in a controlled environment very successfully, and that's been done for 20 years already. So it's just the prevalence that's increasing dramatically now. On the B2C side, especially, for example, in the financial sector, we're seeing vast interest and adoption, many different POCs and real deployments of biometrics in the payment sector. I think that's another great indicator. A lot of the surveys, market studies show that the average consumer is very comfortable now with biometrics and actually wants to see it as part of an option for them to have more secure transactions, whether it's for any transaction or sometimes higher level transactions. But the answer is definitely, it's a yes in both directions.
I think it's a great question. It's actually a question we ask ourselves a lot often. And so I think our experience with it is both. In fact, I'm going to say it's in three. So there's, we describe it as B2E, which means the employee of an enterprise, authentication with biometrics, and then B2B, meaning the enterprise interacting with another enterprise with their application. We see lots of use cases there, and we also see use cases in B2C. So there's no either or. We've considered, is one come first or which one comes first? The answer is we see all of them are occurring depending on the enterprise as to which one or ones they're picking up first.
Yeah, this is well. I'll just add, I think that's all really accurate comments, and I think there is some interesting customization or trends based on what vertical industries, like obviously big retail that's consumer facing, and we're seeing more and more personalizations almost for like VIP customer experience. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting question.
Great. And I think, yeah, moving into there are a few questions very specifically people asking for advice right now, and so I think this is a really great question to end on, and I will go around the panel on this one because I think it's good. But what are the essential next steps a business needs to take to implement biometrics into their environment, or to, essentially protect itself in the era of the data breach, as we've been talking about. I'll start with Rob on this one, please.
First one, do not pick one biometric. It's common, it's human nature that the moment one decides they want to put biometrics into their application, the first thing they do is survey the market and try to determine which one. The amount of time somebody has asked me, Rob, which biometric should I use? It's a great question. There is no answer to this question. Rather, you need to be building your strategy on the basis that you will use them all. And therefore, you need to establish and work through a platform that's going to be able to curate the biometric choices that are out there now and into the future so that you can consume them. So there is no one biometric. It's the most important advice I could offer anyone on this phone. In my years of doing this, you've got to be ready to be able to consume multiple, and these will continue to evolve and change and allow establish a platform that can allow you to adjust to innovations as they come into market. Whether they're on the mobile device, whether they're on a fixed device, or whether in your wearable, all of these form factors will be consuming different biometric types.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Gary, can I get you to weigh in on next steps?
Sure. Yeah, Peter. So even in the most well-off businesses that we see, everybody still ends up having a budget that they have to comply with. So what we would strongly recommend is definitely proper audits on both the cyber and the physical side of the business, so that you can clearly rank and prioritize which areas you have to address first, and put together a proper roadmap to treat them in a way that's going to comply with your budget and make sure that you close the biggest loopholes first. The other point is that you have to do proper market analysis, look at benchmarking that's done. There are lots of independent benchmarks that can give you an idea of different vendors' strengths. And finally, you have to do some real-world stress testing in your own environment. Every condition can be different, and you've got to make sure that when you make a big investment, the technology is going to perform across multiple sites, scale for your size of users and beyond, and be able to work, pretty much in all conditions that you might encounter.
Great. And Will, final words on tangible next steps for companies looking to beef up their security with biometrics.
I would just strongly advise what has come up a few times is to really innovate and think freshly in terms of making sure you have a really good cross-functional team involved. I think traditionally it might say, oh, it's just going to have one department handle this, but no, it really should involve getting the right people together from the physical security and facilities team with IT, with the business unit, and then very much so getting the executive buy-in, as was commented on, because planning for growth on it and deployment is going to be key. So getting all the right people involved from the beginning is going to be a huge step in the right direction.
Great. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you, Will, Gary, and Rob, for the fantastic conversation. For those of you in the audience who still have some questions, I know that there are a lot we couldn't get to today. Please, I'm sure anybody on this panel would be happy to answer them if you reached out to the companies involved. Thank you again to our sponsors, IDEMIA and BioConnect, and thank you everyone who is in attendance for attending. This concludes the webinar presentation. Have a great day.